So a warm welcome to Elizabeth Grill, who is Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of Psychology Services at the Centre of Reproductive Medicine at Weill Medical College of Cornell. And what time of day is it with you when we're talking about 10 a.m. for you?
It's morning, about 10:15.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
I know, end of my day. Thank you for fitting me in on your busy schedule. We have spoken already, and I was keen to chat with Liz about the issues that happen in the bedroom when you're trying to conceive, in a nutshell. And what I've been doing is asking my community, and I wanted to just run through some of the questions and issues that people have been sharing with me, and to then get your thoughts, because I know that the whole emotional aspect of trying to conceive is something that you obviously specialize in, and when it comes to how it affects our sexuality and our sex drive and our sexual relationships, it really takes its toll, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I'm so glad to hear people are actually talking to you about it, because a lot of times they keep it so private and they don't have anyone to turn to, and it's such an important issue.
Well, what was quite interesting was it was a conversation starter that I was planning, and then somebody in my community posed a question saying, am I the only person who's finding that this is all becoming really clinical, and, you know, the kind of fun has gone? And then as the comments carried on in the chat, people were saying, thank you, this is so refreshing. So that starting point of when sex becomes mechanical because you're so focused on that time, that ovulation point, let's start there, because that's the kind of the key thing, that when people are trying to conceive and they're becoming more aware of their cycle, and then sex becomes more prescriptive, what are the first kind of stages of the emotional toll that you hear people struggling with?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's kind of two stages. You have to break it down. There's the trying naturally to conceive, which is what you were starting to refer to, where you're monitoring ovulation, and sex for pleasure and sex for love becomes sex for procreation. And because of that, it really shifts the meaning of that kind of connection and lovemaking to more about how do we make a baby, how do we get pregnant. And so it becomes very methodical and planned and, very predictable, and can often lead to things like performance anxiety or avoidance of sex altogether. And we can talk more about that, but then there's also the treatment phase when people enter into, IVF or IUI, where there's that sort of doctor in the bedroom phenomenon and getting poked and prodded. So different things happen at different stages of this.
Well, before we get to treatment being part of the issue, the performance anxiety is definitely something that the conversation that's been happening in my community has focused around, and the woman not knowing whether to say she's ovulating, to then put pressure on the man, and then him feel that he has to perform, and if he's tired. So what guidance do you offer around that? Because it does become so prescriptive, doesn't it?
It becomes so charged too. I mean, I think first and foremost is the psychoeducational piece, and that is really debunking a lot of the myths. And the myth that many men should be ready, able, and to perform at the drop of a snap of the fingers is really incorrect. And it creates a lot of problems for the men, because they feel that that is true. And if they can't perform at the drop of a dime, they start to feel an incredible sense of shame and failure. And women also feel that that's true. So they start to feel like something's wrong with them. What's wrong with you that you can't, become erect when I need you to, and when I need you to perform, and something must be wrong with you. Are you not attracted to me anymore? And then, of course, the overlay of trying to get pregnant and this precious 24 to 48 hour period that they have, this small window that they feel, real anxiety around making this work. So if they come together and work together, understanding that this is a myth, that men are not supposed to be able to just perform anytime, nor are women. And so that they really have to connect and come back to the basics to be able for everything to work out.
Because the conversation that I've seen has definitely been about, that pressure, and just then what then spirals on from it, the shame around it, or the guilt around it. And it doesn't just stop after that that attempt at intimacy, does it?
No, and then the avoidance can happen, where all of a sudden you'll see maybe the men stay at work a little bit longer, or in the non-COVID years, all of a sudden they have a business trip that they accept to go on right when she's ovulating. And that's what you want. You want to avoid that avoidance. You want to make sure it doesn't get to that. In terms of the question about what to do around ovulation, I really encourage people to speak to their partners about it, to say, hey, is it better if I let you know my cycle and my calendar, so we chart this together and you're aware of when sort of the time is? Or would you prefer that you not know and we just continue to have sex throughout the month, and then ovulation time happens to be one of those times? What you want to avoid is only having sex during ovulation time, because then the man starts to feel very used. And there's this thing called the queen bee syndrome, where they start to feel like their sole purpose is to fertilize the queen bee, right? And we want to avoid that, because men can start to feel used, and we don't want that.
Because some of the conversation has been around how in the build up to ovulation, sex has been pretty regular, but then once ovulation's passed, it's like, well, we've done it there, we don't need to bother. And I know the advice is to try and keep it regularly through the month, but the reality is that so many people don't feel like doing that.
Yeah, I think to have some sort of intimacy and relation throughout the month, and there's even things like you can have non-procreative sex, right? Sex for connection, sex for intimacy during non-fertile times of the month, even if it's one time. And you can choose a different place to do it. So you can even designate, okay, the bedroom is procreation, lovemaking, and the couch is just fun connection again. And that can really help the couple stay connected throughout this. And of course, it's understandable that with all the anxiety and the stress and the depression that comes with this, there's going to have to be some effort made to make sure that that continuity is there.
When there isn't that willingness to talk about this, and like we mentioned, avoidance in physical avoidance, but then there's that kind of feeling of becoming separate, with this as an issue. What would you advise? Is it to seek external support and in these early stages? Because I'm often talking about the importance of emotional support as soon as you can, rather than it getting to a point where everything seems like it's in a total mess. But it's not easy, obviously, to talk about this, and especially if one partner is more reluctant than the other to talk about it. So if communication isn't that easy, what would you say?
Once communication breaks down, everything breaks down. And, to survive the fertility process and to make it through this journey intact, communication really needs to be worked on. The silver lining is that the couples who work on it during this process wind up in much better shape afterwards, in terms of being able to parent better than, let's say, couples who don't work out this communication stuff, and to stay together and to be strong. So it takes a lot of work on top of, something that already feels like a lot of work, trying to get pregnant. But there's no way around it. So definitely seek help with counselors. There are people out there, both sex therapists like myself and infertility trained therapists like myself, who know how to talk to people about this and just get communication going. If you can't do it on your own, just do a couple sessions with someone who can facilitate that dialogue. It's easier sometimes to have a referee or a mediator.
And do you think in these COVID times, that starting point is a bit easier because you've not got to go anywhere? You could just be at home and you're in the comfort of your own home having that conversation.
Yeah, we're seeing definitely an increase in the number of people who are reaching out for mental health services, because everyone's going through such a stressful time and it's so isolating with COVID. But the fertility process itself can be so isolating that being able to now do it via Zoom or FaceTime, whatever platforms people are using, makes it so much easier than having to schedule time out of the office or out of the home to get to an appointment.
What would you say to people who are dealing with low sex drive anyway, and then comes the issue of struggling to conceive and you're still trying naturally, yet you've already got this kind of issue? Is that a case straight away to have someone like you come in and try and get involved? Because it's not like it's something that has suddenly come, it's something that is just how the relationship is.
Well, the pre-morbid, or in other words, whatever people were coming into the fertility journey with, is going to stay with them and probably become worse, right? So if you already had low desire or low libido, or you already had arousal issues, you already had performance anxiety issues or avoidance issues, that most likely is going to carry forward and then become even more complicated. So it's always good to start working on it no matter what phase you're in. I mean, the good news is that most of the sexual issues that are related just to fertility are transient. So they don't really stay with you in the long term. But I will say that whatever your satisfaction level with your sexual relationship was prior to the infertility experience is what's going to carry with you. So it's no matter what stage you're at, whether you've struggled with this in every relationship or it's new just to the fertility experience, now is always better than postponing getting treatment.
And we mentioned about the kind of doctor in the bedroom, and a number of people have talked about how they feel having been poked and prodded, and especially if you've had to go through certain investigations, and then there's the treatment, and then if there's failed cycle, and then if there's a loss, you know, all of these different things from the physicality of it can impact on how you feel about yourself from a confidence point of view, as well as your desire to you know, try and get things happening again in the bedroom. What's your advice there?
Once treatment starts, you're in a whole new ball game with this, you know, because exactly what you were saying, the poking and the prodding and the invasiveness, people really start to not have a good relationship with their bodies in a lot of cases because of the welts from the progesterone shots or the side effects and feeling moody or retaining water and getting bloated or putting on weight with each cycle. So oftentimes they don't want to be touched, you know, and they don't feel good about themselves. So it becomes really tricky, you know, to be able to maintain that level of sexuality when you feel like everything is exposed. You know, your body's exposed to everyone. Doctors and technology are now taking over something that used to be very private and intimate, shared just between two people. So again, the communication is key. I mean, it's amazing how many couples stop holding hands or stop cuddling on the couch while they watch a movie, or, you know, these things are really important even if people are not going to engage in, you know, sex. And I say penetrative sex, right? Because there's a lot of other ways to be connected sexually and physically and intimately without there having to be actual sex involved. And then a lot of times they're being told not to have sex, right? Yeah. So sometimes, you know, there really is the lack of connection because that's part of the treatment.
And it's fair to say, isn't it, that these kind of things can happen to you whether you've been struggling with infertility or not, like if you've been with the same person for such a long time. So not to kind of beat yourself up too much that this is all because of what you're going through. And, you know, that blame game is so prominent when you're struggling to conceive anyway. And I think it is fair to say that all relationships over time need this kind of attention, that whole holding hands and, you know, holding each other and skin on skin, you know, little things that you can do are part and parcel of being with somebody for you know, a number of years anyway.
Absolutely. Talking about myths again, one of the myths is that sex should always be spontaneous and fun and exciting and it should just come naturally. And if you have to work at it, something's wrong with the relationship or something's wrong with the people. That's not true. And that's often, to take the fertility out of it, people who've just been married a long time often get into that notion that somehow something's wrong with us. Our relationship's broken if we're not spontaneously having sex, you know, 3 times a week. So scheduling it in, I tell couples you have to treat this like any other, you know, you're good at your jobs, you schedule meetings, you would never not show up for a meeting with your boss. You have to do the same thing in relationships. And even though it feels, you know, belabored and it feels unnatural to have to sit down and schedule in a date night or schedule in sex, you really have to, because people start to take each other for granted and they don't show up for each other in the marriage or in the relationship.
And do you see that women are more proactive with this, or are there so many? It seems, I mean, my group is predominantly women that engage with me. I know there are some men, but they're not as forthcoming with this type of thing. But when we're talking about scheduling and trying to spice things up and, you know, make things happen, is the onus all on the woman, would you say, in the conversations you have?
No, I mean, I think there's lots of gender stereotypical behaviors as people go through fertility and certainly around the sexuality issues. But I think in this area, there's a lot of misunderstanding of the men. Men don't typically talk about their shame around having to go and give a sample, let's say a semen sample. Women often have very low tolerance for things like that because understandably they're saying, really, you're going to complain about this? You have to go give a sample and I have to take shots every night and go in for retrievals and transfers and everything else. But for the men, it's real. And so some empathy goes a long way on both sides. So I think if women really open up to the anxiety related to not being able to perform or the shame involved in having to give a sample, they'll see that that connection can come back. And men are very motivated to have sex again if they're with someone who's not being critical or they feel like they're going to fail their partners. You know, there's deep, deep shame for men who feel like they can't sort of get their women pregnant. It's a very primitively wired thing for a man. And so they feel terrible. They feel like they're responsible if they can't perform and help their women to get pregnant, right? Even though it sounds very primitive when I say it out loud. So those types of understanding of the man and what he's going through, and of course the woman should be understood too, can go a long way so that both people can come back together and, you know, try to plan things and try and do it. I mean, once men feel comfortable, they're not going to say no to sex.
Yeah.
You know, and you can take turns. I'll often tell people like, okay, this week you initiate and then next week you initiate, you know, so that it doesn't feel, you know, the sex stuff gets tricky. As a sex therapist, you also want to analyze what are people's fantasies. Some women don't want to initiate and they only want the man to initiate. Some people want to, you know, equally initiate. So there's no one size fits all. You have to unpack it a little bit and then work with what each person, each couple wants.
And do you see any difference in terms of what diagnosis might have been given, for example, if it's male factor, if it's unexplained, or if it's a female related issue, in terms of how that impacts what's happening with people's sex lives?
I mean, it definitely impacts depression and anxiety. We do see an increased rate of depression and anxiety, more comparable to women when it's a male factor issue. But obviously, if a man is going through a Tessie procedure, you know, he's also going through invasive surgery that's painful and in areas of his body that are very private and vulnerable, that cause a lot of pain and shame around that. So yes, obviously it's much more involved, but the other issues get complicated too, because women don't vocalize a lot of the anger they feel. If it's a male factor, they don't want to hurt their partners, but that anger has to be dealt with because it's real. And men often shut down because, again, that shame around not being able to produce the natural way. So it's, like I said, it gets very complicated when it's male factor or both. You know, but unexplained has its own issues too. You know, the issue of not knowing and not being able to fix something and having a problem that they can't sort of figure out what it is can be very unnerving for people.
It's so interesting to highlight just the many ways that we struggle, and I think it's so important for people to remember how different we all are, and it's not one size fits all, especially when people are communicating with one another online and, you know, trying to share tips, which is all well and good, but what it comes down to really is to have those conversations with the person in front of you, and ideally with someone like yourself, if people can. But you've got to start by trying to understand what you both need and feel comfortable with, don't you?
That's 100% right. Yeah, it's not a cookie cutter kind of recipe book where you turn to page 54 and you say, okay, now do the activities there. I mean, some things are universal, you know, like starting with giving each other massages again that are non-sexual, just to be able to bring touch back into the relationship, planning date nights, planning non-sexual and sexual activities during non-fertile times of the month. Thinking of ways, you know, the best thing is to think about, why did you guys fall in love? What kinds of things did you do? How did you flirt with each other when you first met? Why was sex exciting then? And bringing some of those things back in, because those things get forgotten when the stressors of everyday life, you know, start to impinge on a relationship.
Yeah, I've had conversations with my coaching clients asking them to take themselves to one of those lovely memories, and afterwards them saying, God, I haven't thought about that stuff for such a long time. And because you get so consumed in all the shitty stuff, don't you? You know, just don't get around to thinking about all that lovely stuff.
One of my favorite activities one of my favorite homework assignments I give couples is to take out pieces of paper separately, number them from 1 to 20, and then list 20 things that bring them pleasure and joy separately, and then come back together and discuss those things. And then see how many of them are similar or different, and then start bringing back at least one of those things in each day into the relationship. And it doesn't have to be, you know, vacations on the beach. We all love that. That can be one of them. But it can be simple things like lighting a scented candle or bringing flowers into the house or putting music on and dimming the lights while we cook dinner. Little things that just start to add pleasure back in.
Really good advice. And whilst we are talking about advice, we're speaking at what is the festive time of year as we head towards the end of 2020, which has been just an unprecedented year, as we've heard over and over again in the news, but so challenging for people struggling to conceive, in terms of treatment being halted, in terms of failed cycles and time feeling like it's literally running away. And then we're heading towards, I don't know what Christmas looks like with you, but in the UK, we are restricted in who we can see, and people are having to decide whether or not they do go and see family, especially if they've started treatment, because they're having to shield. So there is that added pressure on couples or individuals who are trying to conceive, however that looks for them. So considering the time of year it is, are there added stresses? Are there certain triggers that people should be mindful of?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two layers to that. One is the COVID piece, right? Because everyone is so isolated and unable to get together with people they may normally turn to for support. That's really hard during this particular time. But without COVID, just the holiday time has always been a trigger. Any holiday, whether it's, the Christmas time and New Year's or Mother's Day, there's Father's Day, there's all these triggers. Because it usually involves family or family announcements, so that's one thing. Be very self-protective of where you're at, even if you're on Zoom calls and people are announcing pregnancies, or you see that someone's not drinking on a call, you can still see those things that you would have seen in person. The easier thing with these, these internet calls is that you can leave, right? It's much harder when you're at a party and all of a sudden you start to get emotional and you're in the bathroom crying to be able to just say, we're going to leave. But, you really can just limit these things, or maybe you get on a call and you say hi to everyone, and then when you start to feel sensitive or you're done, you just excuse yourself, The commercials, are all geared towards presents and Christmas trees and kids and children running around opening presents and Santa Claus. And so there's all this kind of fairy tale mythology around the holiday time that involves a lot of children. And so it can be very, very painful for people just to see commercials on television, So be ready to limit those exposures, turn things off if it's painful. Now's the perfect year to start your own traditions. So normally I will tell people, look, maybe you don't go for Thanksgiving or Christmas to the big family dinner. Maybe you go on holiday with your partner and you start a new tradition just for the two of you. And it's certainly easier to do that this year without offending anybody, because you can blame it on COVID. You can say we're not interacting with people, we want to stay safe. So it's the perfect year to try that out without it feeling that guilt that people feel when they start to pull away.
I'm grinning at you because I was writing something the other day, and that's exactly something that I suggested, was to come up with some traditions of your own, along with practicing the kind of frozen face if you did want to duck out of a Zoom call, because I think that's a good creative way to leave the call.
Yeah.
Liz, thank you so much. This is brilliant advice, and it's been really lovely chatting through, and thank you for answering a lot of the concerns and points that my community have raised. And I'd love to ask you to join me again, and maybe we'll have a live Q&A session about this kind of thing.
Yeah, I would love that.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.